Welcome everybody to The Waking Space. In this video we're going to tackle the fashion industry. This will be two-parter, and this video really does go well with the mad media, the consumerism, the why we buy, and the advertising video. This can actually bring up a lot of defenses in people. Maybe they really like fashion, or they like wearing certain clothes, or all that stuff, but once you realize how shady this industry is, it kind of will shock you a bit. If you haven't seen the Zoolander movie, it's a great parody on the fashion industry. It makes fun of a lot of the things that are wrong with it. So let's get started here. The fundamental question for this video is, does the cover matter? Does it really matter? Now, a lot of people instinctively say, no, of course it doesn't matter. And I go, really? And they go, oh, well, yeah, it kind of does matter. But then if I switch the question and I say, should the cover matter? Everyone's like, well, no. Okay, well then we have our ideal, right? We should be working towards surface features not mattering, what people wear not mattering, right? So there's our ideal, so we know what we're shooting for. Hey, so fashion, what is it? Fashion is the currently accepted style. Now those two words are very important. Current. If time goes by, for some reason, they tell us we need a new fashion. Now the clothes do the exact same thing, they keep us warm or whatever, but suddenly we need new ones. And secondly, it's accepted. People decide what is acceptable. We're going to talk about who those people are because I'm going to argue it's not us. Style. What is it? Style is actually a distinctive form of dress. It's supposed to exist independent of fashion. It's actually really hard to come up with an example, and I think the only one I can think of is Superman. It's distinct, and it's independent of fashion at the time, right? Nobody was wearing that stuff, so he's got his own style. And that's what makes it different than just any old other fashion. It's unique, it's personal. Everybody kind of used to have their own, and then when things got kind of mechanized, everybody started wearing the same fashion. A little bit more vocabulary here. A fad is a fashion that has a sudden burst in popularity. It comes and it goes relatively quickly. You could think of Sperry's, or you could think of silly bands. Those are good examples of a fad. A classic is something that stays a lot longer than a fad. You could think of like a white blouse and black skirt for women, blue jeans and a white t-shirt for guys. Those are classics. They've stuck around for a long time. Something important to note about fashion in general is that it goes through these cycles. There's an introductory period, there's a rise in popularity, there's a culmination, there's a peak, right? And then it declines, and all fashions go through this. And it's important for the fashion industry that it does go through this so that we keep buying more. This ties right back into consumerism. If there wasn't a cycle, we'd be fine with the very first thing we bought, and we wouldn't need anything else. Great proof of this is in skirt length. You can see by the year how skirt length just changes, but then it comes back. So the very same length that your parents wore maybe when they were a kid, has now regained popularity. If they had just kept that, now it would be cool and vintage. Alright, it's true that the dress in 1915, that version, has not come back. But it doesn't mean it couldn't. But all these other ones seem to have come back. So how big is the fashion industry? Textiles and fashion makes $1.2 trillion every year in revenue. It's actually very hard to wrap your head around how much money that actually is. It's the second biggest legal industry in the United States. And check this out. The US spends $250 billion on fashion, and 173, so more than half of that, is on unused clothing, stuff that's just sitting in our closets. You know, we got that little dopamine rush, we got the retail therapy, and then it just sits in our closet. Imagine where all of that money could be going towards in our society. And we're the largest importer of clothes in the world. Now, we're the largest importer of a lot in the world. We're kind of like the world's vacuum cleaner, and fashion is no exception. Now, when you start to dig deep about fashion, it gets very interesting. Simmel said, fashion seems to represent a kind of anxious effort of elite groups to set themselves apart by introducing trivial and ephemeral demarcating insignia, so short-lasting symbols, right? With a corresponding strained effort by everybody else, because they want to identify themselves with the upper classes. So they adopt the same thing that the rich folk are wearing, and they become a little bit more like the rich folk, right? Well, then what happens, though? The rich have to change their symbols so that they keep setting themselves apart. Fashion really is a weird rat race of a game. And obviously I chose some crazy examples, but those things exist. If you want a great example of how silly the fashion industry is, and it's also great to show your kids, look up the story of the Sneetches by Dr. Seuss. A man comes to town and convinces half the population to get these wonderful stars right on their bellies. Of course, they have to pay him for it. Then the other group gets all jealous that these guys have stars, so he goes over to them and sells them the same thing. And then once everybody has the stars, he goes to the original group and says, well, you don't want to be like them. They got those stars. You want to be different. Here, pay me some more money, and I'll have those stars wiped off your bellies. The guy was a genius, but that's the fashion industry all summed up. So why does the industry use unrealistic body types? And I mean unrealistic. In fact, the one on the right, H&M, got a lot of flack for it. It's an advertisement that put a model's head on a computer-generated body. And the one on the left, well, I'll talk about how unrealistic those are. So why do they keep using them if most people don't look like that? Or couldn't look like that? Well, it creates this impossible ideal that we can never reach. So we're constantly unhappy with who we are and how we look. And so we'll go out and buy whatever they sell. Because contentment makes no money. If we were content, what would we buy? So what's some of the effects of all that discontentment they're feeding us about our bodies? Well, 24 million people in the US have an eating disorder. This thing's a huge killer. Second highest mortality rate within all mental illnesses, topped only by opioid addiction. Whereas 25 years ago, the average model weighed 8% less than the average woman, now it's 23% below her average weight. And the guys are creeping in there. 40% of binge eaters, 24% of anorexia and bulimia sufferers, compared to 10% a decade ago. What's going on there? And only 1% of the research is actually focused on guys. And guys, we know they underreport, so those numbers are probably higher than what they're finding. So because nobody pays attention to it, let's spend at least one slide on male models. Daniel Martin regularly puts his body through hell. For days at a time, he restricts fluid intake so severely that the resulting dehydration causes headaches, haziness, and fatigue. Having trained for weeks like an Olympian with high-intensity circuits, running and weightlifting, and after almost a week of carbohydrate avoidance, he then carbo-loads by eating pasta and sweet potatoes for 48 hours. That forces the muscles to fill up with glycogen so they look bigger, he says. Being dehydrated makes your skin shrink and become taut so that it sticks to the muscles. It makes your veins stand out, which is what the magazines want. And the reason for this torturous ritual of self-deprivation? Martin is preparing to bare his abs in a photo shoot for the cover of one of Britain's top-selling men's magazines. So guys are putting themselves through hell too, just to create this ideal that most guys can't get to. These pictures are also photoshopped, which we'll get into, but this impossible ideal is right there for guys as well. Researchers report that over 75% of women's magazine covers include at least one article about how to change their body. So just start paying attention to this. We're getting it blasted at us all over the place. Alright, that's all I got for part 1, but stick around for part 2. We're going to start getting into the effects. We're going to start looking at how shady this industry really is. And finally, we're going to get into the root causes and what we can do. Thanks for watching, everybody.